Hello and welcome to Kalam's answer writing. So I hope you all had a good week. So we've come to the end of this particular discussion on internal security. So this is the question on terrorism. I've opened up this question for discussion yesterday. Not discussion. I've opened up this question for your thought process to kick in, right? So today we'll discuss this question, and terrorism is a very important topic. Internal security में जितने भी topics हैं, they are very important. They get alternately asked. Sometimes the question is on terrorism, sometimes the question is on left-wing extremism, sometimes the question is on northeast. And then there are also other off topics or side topics like drug trafficking and so on. All these questions can be asked, and they in fact have been asked. Okay, so terrorism is something that you have to prepare very well, and it is not difficult to write points under terrorism because we do have lots of examples, we do have lots of editorial articles over a course of one year or so in relation to terrorism. So it shouldn't be a problem. Everybody has a good number of points. So you should be able to write those points, and you also should be able to write extra points if possible in order to show the examiner that you know more. Right? And whatever you do, you have to maintain a certain flow to your answer. You have to maintain a certain logic to your answer so that the examiner does not feel that any of the points is out of place. The examiner should not feel that any of the subheadings is out of place. Right? You have to keep that in mind. So and before I move forward, this topic is also important from an interview perspective. Interview mein usually the questions are revolving in relation to internal security, of course. If there is a question on internal security, they are more interested on how you perceive the difference between terrorism, Naxalism and so on. Is there a difference between Naxalism and Maoism? How exactly Naxalism and Maoism are different? Right? Is there a difference between extremism, terrorism, militancy, secessionism and so on? You have to be very clear about these definitions. These definitions are not rocket science definitions. They require just a basic understanding, and once you get this understanding, you can take this understanding forward from prelims to mains to interview. It's not a problem. But the idea is to first know the difference between these things and properly settle these thoughts, settle these ideas in your mind so that you will be able to reciprocate it, be it in mains or in the interview. Anyway, so today's question, what is today's question? The question is on terrorism. We will identify the different subparts of this question. So the scourge of terrorism is a grave challenge to national security. We know this part. In fact, this is not a problem which India alone is grappling with. There are several other examples. Take the example of USA. You have the Pentagon blast, you have the 9/11 or the Pentagon, whatever it is called. In addition to this, you have the Boston bombings. There is also a famous movie in relation to that, and so on. And if you want to take Europe, there is another recent set of incidents that have taken place. The Brussels bombing, which has taken place in the recent times, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, within last 3 or 4 years. And there is also a situation of Zaventem airport that has been bombed. Moelbik metro station has been bombed. Now these are isolated incidents, but I'm trying to establish that the idea of terrorism is not something that is hurting just India. And in India, the problem of terrorism is mainly because of what? We know what it is because of. We know who it is because of. Alright? Let us not take the name and spoil the discussion for the day. It is a country which is our neighbor. Anyway, so USA, EU, India, etc. These are just examples that I have given to show that there are several areas in the world which are grappling with this problem of terrorism. That is what this particular first line is trying to tell us. Now, what solutions do you suggest to curb this growing menace? So this is the first part I have to talk about in the body of my answer. Next, I have to talk about the major sources of terrorist funding because he's asked about it. These are the two things that I have to talk about in relation to the question that has been asked. Now, I will evolve the introduction, body and conclusion format like I usually do. And then we will move forward and look at the sample answer. So here's the introduction, body and conclusion format that we have to follow. So the firstly I'll address the body because that is the most important part of the answer. You spend most of your time addressing the body of the answer. So the first side heading is to talk about the solutions, right? So you have to talk about solutions, and the next thing you have to talk about is the sources of funding. And why am I talking about these things? Because these have been precisely asked by the question. So these are the two things that I definitely have to talk about, because these are forming the gist of my question. And then how do I introduce my answer? I can of course introduce my answer by talking about the definition of terrorism, because terrorism as such is often a misconstrued concept. Terrorism is a form of extremism, but there are several other forms of extremism. So you could start off your answer by just talking about the definition of terrorism. That is one good way of starting your answer. Having talked about it, you are not supposed to directly jump into the body of your answer. You could also talk about the several examples that are there. In fact, I just quoted about so many examples, right? You could talk about either of these examples, or maybe all of these examples, to at least show the examiner that terrorism is a problem which is present in most parts of the world. This is something that you have to establish. And next you can talk about solutions, funding, and then you talk about the conclusion. And when you write the solutions, you probably write generic solutions that you have to go for development, you have to make sure that UN is functioning well. But you also have to write a second set of solutions, because that is what is indirectly being asked. Like for example, he is asking you to talk about the sources of funding, and once you identify the sources of funding, you are definitely supposed to talk about how to stop these sources of funding. Now those points you could write directly here, or you could write just before the conclusion, or club them within the conclusion itself, because this is just a 10 markers. I leave that to your smartness. Based on your convenience and thought process, divide these points and write the points which are in relation to the curbing or stopping of funding wherever you want, be it in the first side heading, or just before the conclusion, or within the conclusion itself. So these are the three things that we have to address. And terrorism as such is a challenge to grave national security is the thesis statement, and this thesis statement has to be established by talking about examples. We talked about this. Moving forward, we will look at the sample answer. So here is the sample answer. The first statement, as in the introduction, says what? Terrorism is the usage of force and violence to threaten a population or a government to bring religious or political changes. This seems to be a fairly lengthy statement. My suggestion is, whenever you write an answer, whenever you write points, make sure that your points are not too lengthy. Because what happens when you write a lengthy point is that when you reach the end of the point, you tend to forget what you have said in the first part of the point, right? So when the examiner tries to read your point, by the time he finishes your point, he should not be thinking about what this person has said in the beginning of this particular point. So the points have to be very crisp. Look at any topper's answer sheet. We have done that exercise, which is why we are suggesting this kind of method. Some models have been evolved, like I'm talking about. These models have fetched good marks. Every point that you write has to be crisp. It has to be a standalone point. It should not be a repetition. It should be a single crisp thought, and it has to be put in within 1 or 2 lines if it is a 10 marker, and it could go up to 3 lines or 3.5 lines if it is a 15 marker. So that is the concept that I am trying to instill in your minds. But anyway, so he is defining terrorism, and then he has said that almost all nations, and it is not just India, almost all nations are affected by it. India, there is an example of 1993 Bombay blasts. There is an example of 26/11 Mumbai attacks, and everybody knows about Kasab and what happened after that, and so on. Next, Uri. This is not clearly visible anyway. Uri, you could talk about Pathankot, you could talk about Hyderabad blasts, and some time ago we had a blast in Hyderabad. We call them as the Gokul Chat blast, right? So there are several incidents in India which point towards the presence of terrorist activity, right? India is a very big victim of terrorist violence, especially because of our beloved neighbor. Next, not just in India, you also have but of course the repeated incidents of terrorism in Europe, USA and so on. In USA you have the Pentagon blasts, and Europe you have these examples. I talked about these examples in the first slide itself. In addition to this, you could talk about the Middle East, you could talk about Afghanistan, very important, okay. You could talk about Tehreek-e-Taliban, you could talk about Middle East and ISIS, you could talk about Islamic State of Iran and Levant and so on. All these things you could talk about in order to establish the fact that terrorism is a very prevailing concept. Terrorism is something that is prevalent or ubiquitous. That is something you have to establish. Having said that, move forward, you talk about the solutions. So again, when you talk about the solutions to a particular problem, you have to approach it from a multi-dimensional perspective. Like I talked about it yesterday, I suppose. You should talk about it in terms of economic angle. How do you handle terrorism economically? You can handle terrorism economically by cutting off its sources of funding, or you could talk about how you develop economically that particular region which basically is taking to terrorist activity. If there is a particular region in your country and people of that particular region are taking up arms and conducting terrorist activities, you are supposed to create economic development in that particular region so that people do not feel alienated from mainstream India as such. That is something that you have to do, right? That is an economics perspective. From a political perspective, what are you supposed to do? From an international perspective, what can you do? You need to build coalitions. You need to build support structures, not just within borders or regional frameworks. You need to build cross-border support structures, regional cross-border support structures, or international support structures. United Nations based support, or United Nations peacekeeping force, United Nations based doctrines or resolutions. All these things can be used in order to handle the situation. That is from a political perspective and an international perspective. Then you could look at it from different other perspectives, right? You could look at it from the perspective of radicalization, from religion. You could also look at it from the perspective of social media. How do you handle terrorism through handling your social media? Social media is the major reason why these terrorist ideas are spreading these days, right? The Burhan Wani incident became a big thing because a lot of forwards were happening through WhatsApp, right? So these things, how do you tackle your social media, is something you have to talk about. So what I'm trying to give you is the skill of writing an answer. Whenever you do not have points in relation to a particular subheading, start thinking about that subheading from different angles. And once you do that, you will be able to generate points. And this generation of points, and that too good points, is what is going to eventually help you to write an more than average answer in each and every question throughout the paper. And that should be able to help you to sail you through your GS papers. Ab optional mein kya karna hai depends upon your optional, of course. Anyway, now solutions to curb terrorism. First is the idea of inclusive development, and you have to go for extra focus, especially on those regions which are prone to radicalization. Next, you are supposed to make use of UN strategies of conflict prevention. And there is a convention called the Comprehensive Convention on Terrorism in the United Nations itself, of course. So these strategies you can use. In addition to this, resolution 1267 you are supposed to talk about, because India has been trying to spearhead this particular resolution. Rajiv Gandhi government has introduced it, but the United Nations is not properly implementing this particular resolution because there are problems. Because countries do not want this resolution implemented, because that is going to create a problem to terror havens like Pakistan and so on. Alright, so I finally said the beloved neighbor's name. Anyway, so resolution 1267, this you have to talk about, because this is there in the recent times current affairs. This is also there in recent bureaucrats or defense reports and so on. Next, you have to counter radicalization on digital media. I started out by talking about how this narrative of terror, this narrative of radicalization is basically spreading through social media. You need to counter this. In fact, you have policies like national social media policy. I think it was launched in recent times, or maybe it was about to be launched. So that was a very important aspect in order to handle the communal incidents and the radicalization incident. It was primarily targeted at the communal incidents, but it could also work for terror related incidents. So these are the solution he has given. Let's see if he has given more solutions. We'll move forward and let's see what he has done. So this is what he has done. I'll zoom this particular answer so that it is visible for you all. Okay, it is going to be visible now. Cross-border cooperation, we talked about this. And whenever you have a convicted terrorist is different from an accused terrorist. Accusing में क्या होता है? You are basically alleging that this person is a terrorist. Conviction is one after due process. Conviction is after investigation, prosecution, and so on. In the eyes of the court, it is clear that this person has committed an act of terrorism. Once that conviction is there, you definitely have to follow the policy of zero tolerance. Okay? Accused को तुम कुछ नहीं कर सकते हो, because accused is innocent till the guilt is proven. Accused is innocent till his fault is proven, because you do not know if he has really committed the crime. But once it is clear that he has committed the crime, once he has committed the incident of terror, once you know that if he has not committed, he abetted or supported the act of crime or act of terror, you are supposed to follow the policy of zero tolerance, because this sends out a signal to people. Okay, zero tolerance policy is basically a concept called deterrence policy. See, there is something called theory of punishment. You will read this in ethics. So whenever someone commits a mistake, whenever someone commits a crime, what kind of response do we have? Usually there are three kinds of responses. One is reformation, the other is retribution, and the next is deterrence. This is basically a part of ethics. You will see this in the theory of punishment. And zero tolerance is a concept, you find it in deterrence. When you have a zero tolerance policy and you inflict extraordinary or exemplary damage on the person who has committed the act of terrorism, maybe you give him a death sentence and so on, it is going to create a deterrence, a fear in the minds of terrorists that this particular country is handling the acts of terrorism very seriously. Okay, so that creates deterrence in the minds of these people. Next, moving forward, you need to have special legislations, especially in the coastal states. Not every state in our country is affected by terrorism equally. Some states are affected more, some states are affected less. But the coastal states are prone to being affected more by the problem of terrorism because they are open, because they are laid bare. There is open ocean, anybody can come anytime. Okay, so this Kasab who has come into India, he has come through the coast. And in fact, one fine year, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, there was a Coast Guard vessel, unidentified Coast Guard vessel, which was moving towards Gujarat, and we have chased it away. And that was also reported to be a terror vessel, right? So all these people are trying to come through the coastal areas. So your coastal patrolling has to be strong. Coastal police stations have to be stronger than your continental or internal police stations. They need to have a more strategic depth. They need to have more powers as such, and you need to have certain legislations, Gujpoka, MKOKA and so on. You have to write full forms of these things. Next, you have to talk about the major sources of funding, because that has been asked by this particular question. So firstly, organized crime se paise milta hai, and then you also get money from extortion. So how these terror organizations work? They initially have certain strongholds. Now through terrorism they occupy other areas, and that is what ISIS has done too, right? So once you occupy those new territories, the people in those territories are going to be your victims, as in the people in those territories are going to be exploited. Extortion is going to be committed on these people, and money will be extracted from these people, right? So that is something these terrorist organizations do. And then there is a problem of export and black market. Like for example, this is what ISIS has done. The ISIS has bought a lot of area under its own control, and having done so, and in these areas it had museums, in these areas it had crude oil and other resources, and it started selling these resources in black market, and by doing so it has started earning a lot of money. So if there are certain museums in your hand and you use those artifacts and you sell them in the black market, it is going to fetch you millions, and it is going to give you a lot of arms. And this is what has happened with ISIS. ISIS has earned a lot of money by selling the crude oil, by selling the artifacts and several other resources that is at its disposal. In addition to this, drug financing, counterfeiting, collaboration with other terrorist groups, all these things are major source of funding for terrorists as such. So he has comprehensively covered the major sources of funding, but I want you to notice that in the previous side heading, he has not talked about terrorist funding as such, as in he has not talked about solutions to terrorist funding, and that he is talking about here: Financial Action Task Force, and you have Regional Anti-Terrorist Structure. This basically is coming under which organization? The Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And I want you to write down if India is a member of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in which year it was admitted as a member of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Is it a member or an observer? I want you to talk about this, because this kind of questions typically fares in your prelims examination. शायद क्या पता अक्टूबर 4th में ये भी पूछ सकते हैं. Okay, so it is a possibility. So more importantly, we should shore up our border security to properly fight this particular menace. So this finishes the discussion for today and the discussion for this particular week in relation to internal security. I hope you all have learned something from this particular exercise. Maybe your knowledge about how to write an answer has improved, and that is what I want to instill. Content is more about reading, but writing an answer is more about skill, and that skill is what we are trying to develop. I'll meet you all again maybe next week or the week after. Thank you all. Thank you for your participation.